Hi, everybody. Welcome. We got a full house in person today, and welcome to those that are online. This is the May Homeless Solutions Advisory Council meeting. Nadia, I apologize. I did hear from Vernon, and he cannot make today. Clearly. Next slide, please, if we could. Our first item is always public comment. So if anybody is online or in person, you are welcome to make public comment, or there's always the opportunity to write in to our staff. If you go online to the Washington County website in Solutions Council, there is a link for public comment. There's even a form. Do we have anybody online or in person that would like to make public comment?
Here's that, yeah.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Again, public comment form is available if anybody ever wants to make public comment. We are going to move on to our updates. We are going to start with some staff updates and then move into our committee updates. And we have Director Molly Rogers here today to Jess is out. So thank you for being here. And we're going to give the floor to you.
Thank you, Chair Marshall. For those of you who may not know me, I'm Molly Rogers. I'm the director here of Housing Services. This one I get to play two roles in front of the county, which is really cool. We also have a housing authority, so that's really fun. But really thrilled to be a part of the Human Solutions Council. We did put together a little director's update in your packet, just so that you guys had more of a sort of a formal update in writing, but happy to share with you some really exciting accomplishments that we're seeing with you all. But first, I want to share with you, we hit a huge milestone just this past quarter. We've been working in this room, all of us, to end homelessness for how many decades as partners, but really through the lift of supportive housing services measure, we've really been able to move the needle. We officially can say that we have moved 3,000 households. So that's not just people, 3,000 households who were experiencing homelessness into stable housing. This is huge. It's a lot. I'm going to put Heather on the spot. Do you know how many people that is?
I do not know off the top of my head. I think our average household size is somewhere around 2.5 to 3. So it's a lot of people.
So this will be headlines. I think we do need to shout it from the rooftops, how we face this milestone together. And of course, showing that Washington County continues to make huge progress, and also how many people were homeless in our community not that long ago. So I think that sort of speaks to the need that we face in our community as well. This quarter, we got to present in front of our board of commissioners progress on SHS, and we were able to talk about how we've been exceeding every single goal, except for right now, homelessness prevention. But we do believe once we get the end of this fiscal year, we'll be doing some catch up and be able to achieve those goals as well. But it's important to really highlight, permanent supportive housing is the most cost effective, or most critical strategy to end chronic homelessness and be able to move 224 households into permanent supportive housing, and then 238 households through rapid rehousing is frankly pretty remarkable for folks who are experiencing really deep levels of homelessness that we see there. The other piece, other updates for you all is, I think you guys probably already maybe talked about this before. We finally shared, we went live with our data sharing agreement with HealthShare. So that's really been able to show the nexus of people, obviously it would not just have housing needs, they have healthcare needs, being able to really understand the nexus between those two. We also were named the regional shelter coordinator by the state. So that they really elevating us as a showcase essentially the role that we play in the county through that work. We launched a housing resolutions fund. That's sort of been a new concept and with all of you. And that is really been able to offer one-time financial support and case management to stabilize households that we have sort of since moved in. And then we did submit our year 6 work plan to Metro. We got approval from our own board, be able to submit that, and that goes through its review, but and then we're hoping to incorporate your feedback here for that final work plan, year 6. On the governance side of things, we've been participating or staffing a couple some electeds who are now part of what Metro has convened called the Regional Policy and Oversight Committee, RPOC. They've convened twice now. We have Zoe Copiano as a service provider rep, representing Washington County on that. We'll get more updates from Zoe a little bit later on some of those early conversations. But just for everyone's awareness, Metro in the initial launch of SHS created 2 different governance structures. One was a tri-county planning body, the other one was an oversight body, and they have since converged the 2. They realized they were having very different conversations, different people, guess what? Different representation, different kinds of conversations. And then I think there was confusion overall around what level of authority, what is the decision-making power that they each have. And so they're hoping to reshift the whole composition in order to what they hope be able to tell the bigger story of SHS from having more of the electeds who are across both the counties and the cities and as part of that, as well as service providers and people with lived experience. So it's very new. Still a lot of work to be done to understand their charge and where they will weigh in, but we want to be able to have a transparent story narrative around the impact of SHS in our community, and that for all of you really make a difference. So Zoe can share a little bit more about that. I also wanted to quickly also thank Zoe and also thank Kemp Shuey, who are able to kind of come to our quarterly update with our board and talk a little bit about the work that Community Action has been doing around eviction prevention. So it's nice having the full spectrum of folks who can tell the bigger story to the electeds. It's a really complicated story, but I think you guys did such a compelling job. It was really great. Couple engagement efforts, just to update you very quickly. We continue to have 2 very live community engagement initiatives. One for Safe for Us Village with what we call Central County, Safe for Us Village, and also Cornell Road. And you can see up there, Cornell Road recovery through our Good Neighbor Agreement. So both are very, we had one just last night. Quick shout out to Emily and the team. They did a phenomenal job of working with the community out in Central County. 12 people came this time, and because most of their questions have been answered. And so that is a testament to that continuous need, be able to be a responsive community partner. And so thank you to Emily and her team on that. And then of course we have, let's see, we're out for comment on that one until June 4th, out for comment on June 4th. And then Cornell Road, we're gonna have continued engagement with the community over there. That one is closer to off 26 in Cornell, close to Oak Hills. And we're working on another neighbor agreement meeting on June 17th. And then and focusing and looking at expectations, requirements, and safety. So anyone is encouraged to attend. Right there. And without further ado, are we turning it over to
Back to me.
back to you? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Molly. Any questions for Molly about the whole bunch of great updates? I think I have a question. Is there a way, or would you suggest, how could we engage, support you all with our POC?
To me, it will be, if you have the time to attend the meetings and, I don't know, provide any insight to me that you think, that it will be, I don't know, good for me to know. I don't want to be the only one having, you know, my input or ideas, but it will be very supported to me in that role if I can also gather some input from this council on what, as a Washington County provider, we want to show up there. And what we are aligned to on that will be to me helpful. So I represented, you know, also this table and the county and a homeless provider. So, yeah.
I think the two big the areas that they're gonna want to really grapple with is what they call key performance indicators as a system, and what does that mean as a region? And they're distinguishing that from what they're calling key environmental indicators, which I think is an important, that's an important distinction, that there are things out of our control that happen to us economically, or say the federal government weighing in on certain areas that affects us at the local level. So as you all know, any KPI for us as a system comes down to us as a county, comes down to all of us as service providers. We need your input when they start grappling with those KPIs. Is this workable? Is this even compelling? Is this something you guys are seeing as a good reflection of not just, it should not be viewed as your performance as a provider, but the bigger impact. Are we actually getting in front of the upstream issues around homelessness? And are we getting resolving people's homelessness when they show up in our system as fast as we can through the different ways that each individual may need that to be? You will need your input on that. So keep working through Zoe. You can work through the folks who go directly to those who are on the committee. Unfortunately, they send us those packets around like less than a week before the meeting. So it's a really rapid amount of, and they're like 50 to 100 pages long. So, but I would say keep a keen eye on those KPIs. And then from there, it's going to be about the regional investment fund. And then I think we will need your input, your voice, again, either through informal or formal means. So either like letters from here or from or public testimony. They do accept public testimony, or you know, your informal relationships around, are those the regional goals that make sense for you as service providers of what you guys really need to see in terms of what a regional system looks like? Sorry, that was a way longer answer, but those are the two big ones, I think, Kim, that we would need this group to grapple with.
Yeah, and I bring it up because I have been attending the meetings online. Zoe and I text throughout, just making sure to watch her face. And I would encourage you guys, is it the second or third Wednesday of every month? Second Wednesday of every month from 3 to 6 in the evening. Just put it on as background noise. And I think it's a space that we should be watching and be informed about. We haven't gotten to a place of actual work because the room is filled with elected officials who like to do what elected officials do, I guess. So hopefully soon, maybe we'll actually see some different movement. I can say that I'm not with the county. But I appreciate you being there, and you know, Molly, you're going, and it's frustrating as a partner to watch those meetings. But
I will say,
we're gonna-
the other way you guys could help out, sometimes, as you know, there's a varying degree of familiarity with how we run programs on that committee. So if there are things that you believe are said that maybe be sort of not the most reflective of what is actually happening, that could be maybe the next month, if
Yeah.
something to help address.
Great. Perfect. Okay, thank you. We are going to move on, and Kisa is Housing Services Senior Program Coordinator. I'm gonna do an update on some coordinated entry system stuff.
Thank you. This is Wanda, she, her pronouns, and the system coordination supervisor, which includes our coordinated entry system. We've been doing some really exciting work over the last year, and I'm just here to give a quick update on that, what that looks like. This work really started back in September 2025. Over the years, we've gotten feedback that maybe our coordinated entry system isn't prioritizing, the prioritization of our coordinated entry system maybe doesn't align with what community members, providers, participants would like to see reflected. So we started identifying some of those spaces. In September of 2025, we did a couple of racial equity lens tools that were designed to consider some efficiencies and definition changes that would help us start kind of transforming the system and moving it forward a little bit. In November, we did a provider workshop where we got feedback from our contracted providers around what elements or what kind of household situations they would like to see prioritized when thinking about matching households to housing resources. So we got a ton of feedback from our contracted providers in that space. We took that feedback and turned it into a survey that was available for the community. Providers, community members went out in the HISN newsletter. We pushed it as much as we could to staff and provider agencies. But we asked in that survey for folks to rank the feedback essentially that was provided in the provider workshop and say, out of these elements of household situations, what do you think is most important to prioritize when we're looking at matching people to the limited number of housing resources we have available? So we got some feedback there and turned that into, we outlined what was the highest priority, what were the highest elements of priority that the community had identified. Identified that we needed to write some questions, some new questions for our assessment that speak to those prioritization points. So we drafted some questions and drafted some ways that households could be prioritized. And we took that to a couple of provider feedback groups in April and May. Got really amazing feedback around the language, how accessible it was, how it felt to ask as someone who is doing the assessments and asking these questions, and a better understanding if those changes were reflective of what folks see on the ground and what elements they're seeing in households that really the most vulnerable of our already vulnerable households, if that was aligning with how we were prioritizing. We just on Tuesday, we took that to our lived experience feedback group and got another round of really impactful feedback on how the questions were being asked to make sure, again, those landed well, that they were, we're asking what we know are going to be trauma, maybe triggering questions for folks. So making sure the wording there is as trauma informed as possible and as clear so we can get the best answers that we can. So we got lots of great feedback there. And then I really feel like confirmation of the direction that we were proposing for prioritization. So that was really exciting. We'll be taking that feedback and kind of packaging it all up into some more draft finalization, like final draft questions and final draft prioritization. Taking that to, we'll do a couple more racial equity lens tools on those in June to ensure that we're taking the perspective of who might we be leaving out, what else might we need to include when thinking about these questions or prioritization elements. So, and we'll be asking some of our providers again to be part of that group as well as our internal population. So in July, we'll take that for an internal leadership review just to make sure we are all in alignment before we bring that to this group in August. We'll have some elements of feedback that we asked for in this group too, but the hope is that we can show you all the work that we have done and all that has gone into making these recommendations and question updates, and that we can start training and implementation in August, and really starting with updating the questions and then training providers to make sure that they can ask those new questions, and that we will also be removing some questions so that they're fully trained on the new assessment. I think that is everything. It is like really want to emphasize August is just the start. It is like a long road after that. We want to make sure this is done really thoughtfully, that we have elements of doing some additional racial equity analysis in the future, so that before we go live with any prioritization change, that we really understand the impact it will have on the participants who are currently on our list.
Wonderful. Yes.
What are you most excited about that this is gonna do to the system, Lisa?
Oh, I love that question. What I'm really excited about is that my hope is that it will be more reflective of what is important to our community. We've gotten a lot of feedback that, what we're doing just doesn't quite land. And we want to make sure that it is reflective, and because we want this programs to keep going, and the more that everyone is invested in it and understands it and that it's explainable, like the better chance we have of this continuing on. So I hope the impact will make everybody more informed and aware and feel like they had a voice in the process.
Can I ask a very basic question?
Yes.
Being newish to the council, so so the coordinated entry system, those are questions that like community action is, you have someone come into the system, sorry if it's the
No.
basics, I just want to understand. They come into the system, there's questions that are asked, or maybe through our outreach providers. Okay, so it's
Yeah.
literally just the screening of someone coming in off the streets and just making sure that they're comfortable with all the questions.
Yep.
That you're asking, and you're getting the information you need.
Mhm.
Okay, I thought it was that,
Yeah.
but I just wanted to.
No.
Yeah, and the
great
biggest change is this, we're gonna make it 911, so that you can answer those questions.
Oh, thanks, thanks, and that's on the record now.
No, really, really good question.
Can you
I did
describe
just-
the four parts of coordinated entry? I think that would really help Kim.
The,
Like the access assessment,
Oh.
patient referral.
Yeah. So the first step is the access point, and the access points are really all over. So yes, the Community Connect phone line, we have outreach workers, we have housing liaisons, our shelter
Shelters.
system. All of those are really part of our access to Community Connect coordinated entry. And then assessment is asking the questions. Then we have the prioritization piece where, we will likely always have more people in need than we have resources available. So we use the information that they've given us on the assessment to say who out of this list of, yes, very vulnerable people is the most vulnerable. And then how do we refer those to available housing resources?
Gotcha, yeah, thank you.
I want to comment and congratulate the county on the strength of the coordinated entry that other counties don't have as a tool for this, and the work that Keitha does with even the Community Connect phone line and strengthen the support more than the work, the support, and with the data and with visibility and stuff in a daily basis is outstanding. Like outstanding. Like I am part of that continuous improvement, and I feel proud. Like 3,000 is because of that tool build and strength through these years, and that is not likely to not paying attention to, because not all the counties have that, and I'm going to elevate it, and because it is. I mean, we have 3,000 move in because we did a coordinated approach, and we need an effective matching that we are continuously improving every day. You did. Thank you.
That's cool.
Yeah.
So many positives today. It's great. That's what we needed this week. Okay, thank you, Keisa. Any other questions for Keisa? Thank you for your presentation. We are going to move on to Katie. She's going to talk about some continuum of care stuff.
This is a consent agenda item for all the HUD reports that we have submitted year over year. Sorry, we submit 4 annual reports each year to HUD. The longitudinal system analysis, which is due in February-ish.
Usually mid to late January.
Great, we're gonna tag team this.
Hmm.
System performance measures usually due in February. Point in time and housing inventory count. Normally do in April, but how does that? So these different reports, Heather's gonna spend an hour talking through this today. So you all understand these reports, what is in them, that's like the majority of our agenda. But you also all have to approve this as our COC board to be submitting these and designate the authority to Washington County to submit them. So this is your consent agenda item to do that.
And if you wanted to see a physical copy of the reports, we didn't print many, but there is one printed copy of each of them here in the middle.
Because of expedited timelines, were a few of these already submitted before no?
All 4 of these have been submitted.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Drew. Yes,
Yeah.
yes. So this was sent out, hopefully reviewed, because we do need to vote on this. Any follow-up questions first? Great. So we, as the Continuum of Care Board, are being asked to approve the consent agenda item to submit the required HUD reports, LSA, SPM, PIT, PIT, and HIC to HUD. Do I have a motion?
Motion to approve.
Thank you, and a
Second.
second. Thank you, Drew and Zoe. Now we will take a vote. All in favor, raise your hand, virtually or in person. Great. Thank you. Anybody abstaining? Okay, wonderful. Then this vote has passed. That was kind of easy. Okay, next, Nadia.
Oh, we have one more.
We have another one?
The second one.
Oh, sorry, this is also mine. We sent out a memo to you all about a procurement subcommittee. This is the authority you all have as a COC board to nominate a procurement subcommittee and grant that procurement subcommittee the authority to review materials, evaluate applications for the COC, and make recommendations to you all for approval. Part of the reason we do this, one is because HUD moves really quickly. You all don't meet as fast as HUD moves when they release a notice of funding opportunity. And 2, we anticipate this year to be quite a bit different than previous notice of funding opportunities. So the flexibility to be nimble and responsive to the funding asks that are getting released in that notice of funding opportunity is quite quick. Staff facilitate this procurement subcommittee in your agenda of materials. We recommended 5 folks for this subcommittee. Thank you, Adam, as a kind of liaison between, part of that group of 5 is folks that are don't have a conflict of interest because they're not applying for COC funding. But are related to COC. Also Jim Bain, who used to sit on this committee, has agreed to be on it. So we're really excited to bring Jim back. And looking for you all to give approval. That committee, we are expecting a notice of funding opportunity to be released next Friday. The federal government has released intention to release. And so we are expecting that. They do have to release by June 1 in alignment with congressional direction. But happy to answer any questions before we jump into or promotion.
Any questions? Not hearing any. So the request before us as the Continuum of Care Board is to approve the consent agenda item that names the procurement subcommittee members and gives the subcommittee authority to review materials, assess applications, and provide recommendations for approval. Do I have a motion?
I can motion.
Thank you. And a second, please.
Second.
Thank you. Great. Take a vote. All in favor? Raise your hand.
Adam, you.
I have to abstain, right?
Thank you.
Why?
Perfect. Okay. We have 1 abstain. And then we have a couple absent. Okay, perfect. Thank you, everybody. That motion has been approved. Now we can go to Nadia.
Yeah.
All right, well, we have spent, I think it's been a few months now, going over applications for, new appointments to Solutions Council. We had about 12 applicants and we interviewed 5. And we have 2 new recommendations for you to vote on appointing, vote on recommending to appoint to the Board of County Commissioners for final approval. So our 2 recommendations are Bob Grover and Jason Green. We sent some information about them to you and it's here as well. They're both stellar candidates, in my opinion. We had an interview panel of both staff and chairs from this committee who were able to get to be part of these interviews. I don't know if Kim, you want to say anything before you vote, but.
No, I appreciate it, Drew. Thank you for being a part of that as well and getting to know all of the applicants. And it's fantastic that people want to be engaged and involved. And Bob and Jason are going to be real value adds to this conversation here at Solutions Council. So I look forward to them joining us in the months to come once the Board of County Commission approves this. But we do have a vote to make. So we are being asked to vote to approve the recommendation that Bob Grover and Jason Green be appointed to the Solutions Council for submission to the Board of County Commissioners. Do I have a motion?
I'll motion to vote.
Thank you. And a second?
I can second.
Thank you. And let's do an all in favor. Perfect. Don't think anybody needs to abstain and we just have our few absences. Okay, wonderful. So it has been moved and this will be taken to the Board of County Commissioners, I think on Tuesday. Yeah. So
Great.
fast turnaround.
Cool.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, everybody. Okay, we're gonna keep going with our updates.
So quickly.
What'd you say?
Local government works so quickly.
Right. Next slide for me. Okay, perfect. So our committee updates. Hannah, would you like to do lived experience?
I think Kisa kind of already went over. We met on Tuesday, talked about prioritization, but I think she pretty much covered. We reviewed some questions to make sure they were trauma informed, clear, and kind and thoughtful. So that way the individuals that are going through their assessment truly understand what the questions are asking, making sure it kind of encompasses the whole population, kind of talking about like whether or not an adult was in the home, was in foster care as youth, just kind of making sure like the wording was really intentional. Outside, we had a really great conversation. I think there was a lot of really great feedback that was supportive and intentional. It gained a lot of other people's experience when those questions are asked. And I think we have a really good prioritization process, or prioritization, not necessarily process, but identification to move forward. So.
Thank you. Hack.
HAC has a new co-chair as well, Haley Purdy, and they are going to be talking about the budget and some new policies for approval for HAC to go to Chabad this month.
Okay. McKinney-Vento.
Hello. Currently we are at close to 2,500 individual students qualified in Washington County for McKinney-Vento. We're continuing to see the same trend that we saw since the beginning of the school year, increase in families qualifying due to high emergency situations, a lot more families in their vehicles compared to previous years. We've also seen an increase in families actually declining McKinney-Vento support because of that federal program in the name. So a lot more families, especially with the re-increase in ICE activity. A lot more people are hesitant to accept services from something labeled as a federal program. And so that's been very difficult in trying to get the word out to reassure folks that all their information is confidential. We're here as a support system. In that same regard, because of that increase in ICE activity, we are continuing to see more and more individual kids become qualified as unaccompanied youth because parents are either being detained or self-deporting. Unfortunately, right now we're also seeing a lot more budget cuts across school districts, and so that means in some areas layoffs, in some districts reduced hours for McKinney-Vento liaisons, and also just in general reduced funding for resources. At the national level, current presidential administration is proposing more cuts for programs that support McKinney-Vento and houseless youth for fiscal year 25-26. Fortunately, there is a silver lining that there is bipartisan support. So all the previous proposals have been shut down by both houses of Congress. And so the expectation is that there will be continued bipartisan support for McKinney-Vento services, and any proposals from the Trump administration to remove funding will be shut down.
Thank you. Not much in there. Feels like we talked about RPOC. Zoe, we good with anything else you wanna?
Yeah, no.
Okay. And then anything else? I did want to mention that our very own Christina was approved by the Board of County Commissioners as a new member of the Behavioral Health Committee. So that's fantastic.
Yeah.
Any other updates that anybody would like to share? Okay. Great. We are gonna dive into the meat of this meeting. And Heather is here to take us through all of that. So welcome. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me. So I'm gonna be going through some data slides, in my attempt to consolidate all of the reporting that we do at the county into the most important pieces to help you understand how our system is going or operating. So before we get into the data slides though, I did want to start, if we could go like 2 more slides forward, to a framing question. So as I'm going over this data, what I would like for you guys to be thinking about in the back of your minds is what data is most meaningful to you in your role as an advisory body? What do you need to know about our system to provide advice and support to us as we are operating our homeless services? And as you're seeing this data, like what questions does it bring up from that perspective? What else are you missing as we go through this data? Okay, so let's move into the next slide. Reports overview. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm gonna go over just a quick summary of the reports that we do on a regular basis that are kind of like the core of our system's reporting. So starting with the federal and HUD reporting that you guys just voted on, letting us approve. The longitudinal system analysis is the first one that kind of kicks off what I call HUD reporting season. It's also the abbreviation is LSA, so we talk about LSA a lot. It means longitudinal system analysis. This is actually a pretty lengthy process for us. We start work on the LSA in October, usually try to finalize it by the end of December because it is due to HUD usually mid to late January. The timelines are always a little off, and they don't necessarily tell you right away. This report is intended to measure the impact of our program and analyze system-wide patterns and outcomes. One thing I do have to note though about the LSA is that due to our eligibility requirements for HCMS, it had a program type code that is actually excluded from the LSA. And so as we are trying to use that report as a tool to understand our system, it's been missing a very important chunk of our system. We did make some eligibility criteria changes for HCMS that went into effect January 1, 2026, changing the program type code. So when we get to the next LSA, HCMS will be included. The LSA also, it only focuses mostly on shelter and housing programs, but the housing programs it focuses on are permanent supportive housing and rapid rehousing. So it's not including data around coordinated entry, outreach. Some of our housing programs are homelessness prevention. So system-wide, but it is missing a few gaps. Then the next HUD report is the system performance measures, also known as the SPM. This is one that we're usually working on in February. HUD usually announces it that it's open early in February, and then we usually have in about 4 weeks to work on it. And it's another report that it is aiming to assess the outcomes of the entire system. There are like very specific performance measures that HUD has defined, and each measure, there's 7 measures. Each measure has multiple sub-measures as well, so there's actually a lot more to it. Another thing to note about it is it also does not include coordinated entry or homelessness prevention programs. There are also some metrics, measure 4, that are only for COC funded programs. So when we're using this report, those metrics are only helping us see, you know, roughly 200 to 300 households at the time. Next slide, please.
Heather, what does HCMS stand for?
Oh, Housing Case Management Services.
Okay.
It is our biggest housing program that does the long-term rental assistance, or ARLA, the regional long-term rental assistance program. It's the core of SHS programming in Washington County.
Okay.
We have the capacity right now to serve 1640 households in that program. So it's been missing a pretty big chunk.
Yeah.
Okay.
All of our scattered, yes.
Yeah. All right, moving on. The next 2 federal reports, they actually kind of happen in tandem with each other on a similar time frame. So the first is the point in time count, or the PIT. This is the annual snapshot of the homeless population. It's on a night HUD requirements, and a night that we choose in the last 10 days of January. So we do get to choose. We usually do some regional coordination to make sure that all the counties are counting at the same night. And this is a report that is used nationally to compare homelessness across the nation. And it also helps drive funding. A lot of communities compare each other's point in time counts to kind of figure out relative size to each other, essentially. So you try to look for, when you're comparing your outcomes, you look for other people who have a similar point in time count as you. But we also know that the point in time count is an undercount because it's a snapshot. And there's 2 components of it. One is the sheltered count, so who is in our shelters on that night. So that count is usually a reflection of our shelter capacity. And then there's the unsheltered count, which we only do every other year. And that is where we go out and try to survey the community and identify the people who are homeless and get that count. It is used nationally, and the public really likes this report. The housing inventory chart is also a snapshot. It is a snapshot of capacity and utilization of all of our shelter and housing programs on whatever night we chose for a night of our PIT. I'd like to highlight that this is a report that focuses on the bed capacity, so the number of people that we can serve. And that's a little bit challenging in our system because we contract based off of households. So there's a lot of work that goes into trying to figure out how do we make sure that the utilization comes out correct. You know, when we have a provider who can serve 20 households in housing, we want to make sure the number of people can be variable. This is most prevalent in our family-based programs. So like Family Promise Bridge Shelter can serve 70 households. The number of beds that is on a given night is widely variable depending on the household composition. And so this is where it gets a little bit tricky trying to understand trends from the housing inventory chart because we're reporting on beds, but those are a little bit variable. So just like to frame those uses and challenges. Next slide. I'm going to highlight 2 of some of the more local internal reporting that we do. The biggest one would be the Metro annual report. We also do quarterly reporting, but the annual report is the biggest one. This is defined by Metro in terms of what they want to see for system outcomes for SHS. They do some system level metrics as well, but it's predominantly focused for SHS needs. We're usually working on this from July to October. And it does have a lot of helpful information that supplements our HUD reports. And then I like to flag that we are working on a new system analysis. This is part of the local implementation plan work. We are working to define exactly what we want the system analysis to be, what it should include. But the goal is that this would be an annual process that we go through to provide additional analysis on system throughput, system bottlenecks, and any needs that aren't available in other reports, or we might consolidate information from the existing reports into that system analysis and kind of have one central place. Where I think this is gives us the most freedom to analyze that we don't have in the other reports is around our coordinated entry and like that system throughput specifically. All right, so those are the main ones. Next I want to go on to what can we learn from these. And so we're going to go through a couple different buckets. We're going to start with who is accessing our services and what does it need? So what do these reports tell us about that? Then what do our reports tell us about what is working well in our system? And then where are there challenges in our system? And I'm going to say, like, there's a lot more data in each of these reports. I'm just trying to pull in the highest levels. So if you're interested in more, you can dive into, I know that the summaries were sent of all the HUD reports already. So you can dig in more. All right, next slide. So starting with who is accessing our services and what is the need, we can see that there's been a kind of a growing number of households and people that have been served since the implementation of SHS. So the left-hand side of the screen is showing something from the LSA, that is the household served by program. This is one we didn't have trending readily available, but you can see for the last LSA how many households were served in each of these program types. So we had over 1,500 households go through our shelter or transitional housing programs, over 1,000 households go through rapid rehousing, and then 500 go through our permanent supportive housing, and that is the one that is missing HCMS, so that number would be much larger if we had that included. Permanent supportive housing in this report is mostly shelter plus care, and then we do record HUD BASH in HMIS, so that number is included as well.
In a perfectly functioning system, would those numbers be decreasing every year or increasing, or is there like an expected, like, if we had our way, if this is what the graph would look like?
I think eventually we would like to see it, well, I think it kind of depends on the program area. I think the total number of people served, I would like to see going kind of stabilizing or decreasing over time. But there's so many factors. I mean, it's around, do we have enough capacity to serve the people that we need to serve? So assuming we have enough capacity to serve the people that we need to serve, I would hope that shelter and transitional housing would eventually be decreasing, maybe to a point of becoming stable, to where it's like people become homeless, they have a short stay in shelter, and then they move out. Then programs like rapid rehousing would stay relatively stable as there's like people cycling through that. PSH is the one where it's ideally in a perfectly functioning system, it'd be kind of growing with the need, but if you've met the need, then hopefully it would level off and kind of stay consistent.
Thank you.
There's a question. Like, is this just, it's a snapshot? So if someone went into emergency shelter for one night and came out, they're included in this number?
They are included in the number. Yeah. And they're only included once. This is a unique count. So if they end up going in and out of shelter throughout the course of the fiscal year. So this is for LSA, it's actually the HUD fiscal year, which is 10/1. Let me make sure I get my years right for which report this is. It's 10/1/2024 through 9/30/2025.
Okay.
So through the course of the year, they were served at least one time. For the housing programs, served means housed. So it doesn't count the people who were enrolled in the housing program and not yet housed at the time that this report was ran.
Do we track recidivism?
Retention and returns to homelessness?
Well, yeah, like,
Yes, that is another part of system performance measures, and then it's also part of our Metro annual reporting.
Okay.
I'm gonna highlight the graph on the right, which is where we do have some trending for the system performance measures. And that's where you can see that, we started to grow quite significantly in the first 3 years of this chart, and then we've stable, like kind of leveled off for the past few years, and that is mostly a function of our capacity becoming more stable. Drew, did you have a question?
Yeah, if somebody is enrolled in a housing program but not housed and is on the street, where are they coming?
They wouldn't be included in this number.
Okay.
Because they're not housed yet, and then they didn't go to shelter.
This is where the HUD reporting is sometimes flawed and why we rely more on our metro reporting than just straight HUD reporting.
Yeah.
Okay. There's still an access and a touch point in our system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Let's move on to the next slide.
And the staff.
Right, yeah.
So this is where I'm going to talk on the left side about our point in time count. This chart is mostly focused on the shelter homeless count because we only did a shelter count this year. You can see that top light blue dotted line is the total point in time count. And you can see the years where we did a street count because that's above the dark blue line. The dark blue line is the sheltered homeless count. And you can see that that grew and then has been stabilizing a little bit. And I think that is where it really comes down to the sheltered count is more of a reflection of our emergency shelter capacity. We've been increasing our capacity, but it has stabilized more in the most recent years. So that number is kind of staying stable. If you look at the gap between the line, the blue line and the dark blue line and the dotted line, our unsheltered count has actually been pretty stable for the last 3 years that we have conducted one, being around 230 people being identified in the unsheltered count. The bottom line on the point in time count is our chronically homeless count. So that's of all the households that were in the point in time count, which ones were chronically homeless. And you can see that that trend line is kind of following the same progression. And just kind of shows the growth of that in our community. For the right-hand chart that is from the system performance measures, this is the persons experiencing sheltered homelessness. So this is a unique count of everyone who experienced sheltered homeless at some point in the fiscal year. So 10/1/2024 through 9/30/2025, kind of giving us that more holistic picture. Again, it's just sheltered, and it's a very similar trend though of, kind of growth and then stabilization as our shelter capacity has stabilized.
What's the time threshold for what's considered chronically homeless?
It's a very complicated flow, but the first thing is that they have to have a disabling condition. That's regardless of anything, they have to have a disabling condition, and then their length of time homeless has to be 1 year. That's the general rule of thumb. There's some exceptions where people can't keep their status if they're housed for less than 7 days. But that's more or less like disabling condition, 1 year or more homelessness. Let's keep track of my notes. Move on. So the next slide is where we get some of our internal reports that allow us to dive in a little bit more. So the left-hand side is our phase 1 assessment volume over time. So how many households have had a phase 1 completed fiscal year over fiscal year? And this is basically who's entering our coordinated entry system. And you can see that there was rapid growth in that as we started implementing SHS. And it kind of started stable the last 2 fiscal years, but what we're seeing this fiscal year is at least through, there's a typo in the chart, through 12/31/2025, not 2026. We were actually forecasting, like, if that pace, we'd had 2,400 households complete a phase 1. If that continues, we would end the fiscal year at about 4,600 households, which is potential starting to show a decline in volume. We need to see if that sticks. I haven't reran the numbers since this. And we also need to determine if there's seasonality. So a few more questions I have, but at least we are maybe seeing a reversal of growth. And then when we're digging into who is having this phase 1 assessment, we are seeing the chart on the right talks about their living situation. So the light blue bar is chronic homelessness. Then the kind of teal bar is literal homelessness, which everyone who's chronically homeless is also literally homeless. And then the dark blue is those who are considered involuntarily doubled up, and the final one is those that are at risk of homelessness. So they are housed, but they are at risk of losing that housing. And this is where there's kind of an interesting, at least halfway through the fiscal year, that shaded like the slightly light, more opaque bar for fiscal year 2026 is what we're forecasting based off of the midway point. And it's interesting to see that we're actually seeing an increase in the at risk, but decreases in some of the other categories, or stabilization in some of the other categories. And we think that this could potentially be related to changes in eviction prevention resources in the community.
Well, the chronic, I would imagine the chronically homeless list is gonna get smaller too, because eventually those people are making their way into permanent supportive housing or other resource, right?
Well, this is a reflection of the initial phase 1 assessment volume. So yes, hopefully year over year, the chronically homeless would go down because we have been housing this group. But this is kind of, we don't take them off of this number once they're housed. This is kind of initial starting point for this graph. If anything, their chronic homeless status, we might see by the end of the year that some of the people who were originally flagged as literally homeless, they might age into chronic homelessness, because we evaluate this at the time we run the report, not necessarily at the time that they enter. Okay, let's move on to what is going well in our system. There are two, we can switch to the next slide. Two graphs here that I like to call out. So from our system performance measures, I really like to highlight the chart on the left about street outreach. We saw a really huge increase in positive exits in the the 2024 system performance measures. We had to validate that number because it seemed so high, but it was accurate. And that success has continued. And I really do think that that's a reflection of a lot of the work that our county has been doing with street outreach teams, with the LC3 case conferencing, and just a really a lot of targeted effort to move people from unsheltered homelessness into either housing or shelter or temporary destinations that is considered a positive exit for street outreach. And then the chart on the right is looking at all the exits from emergency shelter, transitional housing, and rapid rehousing programs into permanent housing destinations. So this is just permanent housing. And we've been seeing that stayed steady, but in the most recent one, we saw an increase, and that is largely due to the fact that the households that were first housed in our enhanced rapid rehousing program were reaching their 2-year mark, because rapid rehousing is a up to 24-month program. So a lot of the first people housed in that started exiting in this system performance measures fiscal year. And so you can see the impact that the growth in that housing program has had in helping people exit to permanent housing.
You just got 25% up to 69. It's huge. Street outreach. I mean, we need to unpack that, I think, more, Heather. Better tell what happened. So it's huge.
It's huge. Next slide, please. Some other things that are going well. And this number is going to be different than what Molly shared earlier. On the left-hand side, this was as of 3/31/2026, and all of our HMIS data, we actually had, I can't read that number, 4,400 households housed in housing programs. It's different than the 3,000 number because it includes some housing programs not in the 3,000 number. So that is including all the HUD VASH vouchers that we have in HMIS. We have EHV vouchers in there. A lot of rapid rehousing that goes directly from the state to community action. That all gets included in there. So we are housing a lot of people. I really like to highlight how much we are housing people because we are being very successful in that. And the chart on the right helps to also highlight that as well. So this is technically included in our point in time, like our own write-up that we do of analysis, but it is one that we internally create. And this is a analysis of what happened to the households that were chronically homeless in the last 2 point in time counts, and where were they as of this year's point in time count. And this is where you can see that while chronic homelessness has been growing or stabilizing over the last few years, it's new people coming in. This was consistent in last year's point in time count as well. You can see the chart kind of helps you follow where people are going, and you can see how many were housed, had another positive resolution, or exited our system, and we can only assume that they resolved their homelessness. And I think what to really highlight is out of those years, there just weren't that many that were still homeless as of the point in time count. And so of the 358 households that were chronically, or individuals that were chronically homeless in the 2026 point in time count, 300 of those were brand new. Like this is the first time we've counted them in a point in time count. And so what I really like to highlight and what I think is really important in that RPOC work of differentiating between key performance indicators and key environmental indicators is our system. We are being very successful at housing people and moving people out of homelessness to the extent that we have capacity to serve. And yet the challenge is still growing. Homelessness is growing, which seems to make this, like this provides evidence that this is less of a homeless services system failure and more of an economic systems failure, that people are moving into homelessness despite all the great work that we do. Okay, let's move on to the last slide around where are some challenges. And these are more just things that I wanted to highlight on. The first one on the left is our phase 1 inactive rates. This is something that we need to look at a little bit about how we're doing phase 1 assessments. There's a lot more data to dig into to figure out who is going inactive, why they're going inactive. But what you can see is out of all of the households that get a phase 1 assessment, who have had a resolution to that phase 1 assessment, we are seeing that about 50%, pretty much on average, get moved to inactive, which inactive from coordinated entry means that they've gone 90 days without any system interaction. So they haven't called our coordinated entry line to say, hey, I still need help. They haven't been in a shelter. They haven't gone to a day center. They're not connected to street outreach for 90 days. And then we move them to inactive. We also have some very new data that I didn't incorporate into here because of how new it is, but what we're also seeing, we just started being able to report on returns from inactive, and we're not seeing a high return from inactive. We do see some, but it's actually pretty low volume of people returning.
Let's assume the positive.
And so then the chart on the right, I included, this is the only chart I included from the housing inventory chart, where you can see this is for all of our permanent housing programs. So PSH, rapid rehousing, HCMS, all of our housing programs. We can see the impact of our capacity stabilizing over the last few years. And I'm highlighting that as a challenge because as we're seeing homelessness grow and capacity stabilizing, it's just going to bring up some additional questions and strategies about how do we still meet the needs of our community. All right, and with that, we can move on to the next slide, one more. So going back to that framing question, I'd like to have a little bit of discussion and just more of an understanding from all of you, is just how, what data is most meaningful to you in your role as an advisory body? What of this that I showed already was the most helpful? What was missing? What would you like to see more of? What would you like to see less of? Just what kind of questions does this bring up for you?
When I looked at the slides the first time, that's like all of it. I don't know. It's all great to see.
I do think that I know that maybe there's another report that would show folks that are, participating in our system that may not be either housed or in a shelter or a transitional living program. And I'd like to look at that a little bit because I think there's they're still being served by someone, right? And so there is a lot of work being done to support those individuals that we might be missing or not necessarily accounting for, and by not counting them. I think it's one of the questions that I often have with our performance metric that outlines, capacity, like, because it also only collects on those that are housed rather than those that are enrolled into our programs. And really kind of discounts all of the work that the individual youth in our case is doing while unhoused and the work that is being done to support that individual while they remain unhoused.
Uh, to me, it will be helpful to understand is the time that, you know, from phase one to either house or either shelter or and from shelter to any housing program. So and then probably with that understand if there are gaps on what is needed to support movement.
So it's almost like you're reading our POC's mind.
Be interesting to, and maybe I stepped out, maybe you talked about it, but like if there are any numbers on success rates of that, like the housing liaison program, so folks that maybe are exiting or alleviating their housing issues prior to be, or, you know, without being enrolled into a program, but through the efforts of the housing liaison.
But you guys are checking the time, because I see that on our reports.
Drew probably doesn't see that because he doesn't have the liaison program.
Yeah, no, on the HCMS. Yeah, no, and actually HCMS.
The days to house.
Yeah, they saw.
We do have that. It sounds like what you were asking for was more of like that holistic
Just
picture though, of like
yeah.
how long does it take, which
Yeah.
is something we can start to report on more often. It's actually something that we've been including in our system analysis framework of a throughput of here's the average time from phase one to referral to enrollment to housing.
Yeah.
So I hear what you're asking for is also a little bit of a picture of the shelter. That's more like what's the journey through the system and days in each step of the journey.
Right, particularly right now where Arla, we're not having the same, you know, trajectory, and days in shelter are very high.
Yeah.
I'd love to understand it better as well.
Are you metrics that help us understand how balanced of a system we have?
Right.
Yeah.
Because I think we are in a space where people are sitting in shelter longer because we, you know,
When do we pivot?
right, right.
Yeah.
Lots of variables and, you know, as to
Yeah.
why that might be, right?
Right.
And circling back to what Drew just brought up of, it sounds like you're interested in seeing more about the health and outcomes, because those have been excluded. Those the only program, they're not included in any of the HUD reports, but they do have a
Why is
positive
that?
impact. It's the way the HUD reports are defined, where they don't include services only. And so what I'm hearing is that gap in even our internal reporting where we can highlight the outcomes
Yeah.
of that program more.
So I feel like it's pretty positive.
It's really positive. Services only looks very different across the country. So asking
Oh,
everybody,
okay.
every COC to report on services only
Got it.
is very complicated for HUD, who looks at 330 COCs.
Okay.
So like Multco even doesn't run a liaisons program, right? They
Oh.
have like other volume of InReach, right? InReach just looks different. So, and supportive services only can be workforce programs, it can be community warehouse, like it can be a lot of things. So trying to make them all equal and have the same outcomes is really challenging. Yeah.
I mean, I feel like kind of see it as our way of filling a gap in homeless prevention.
Totally.
Like, I mean, working upstream, you're not working upstream, because they're in the stream now. Yeah, a little bit of homeless prevention.
Okay.
Heather, I apologize.
Oh, sorry.
No, please go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to mention, I mean, looking at these charts, I can't help but view them through the lens of the work that I do. Because, I mean, we have a much broader definition of what it means to be houseless or having housing instability and looking at things like the point in time count. I mean, I recognize that those don't take into account situations like, you know, somebody might have been evicted and so they're temporarily staying in like a hotel while they try to figure things out, or maybe they're, you know, couch surfing. And so I do know that there is legislation being proposed at the federal level to align those definitions so that the HUD definition is more broad, just like the McKinney-Vento definition. So hopefully that does give a bit more realistic insight into what's actually going on in our communities. Also, I just wanted to say how like happy I am to see the all the work that's been done with the street outreach work, especially like the positive exits, just because like I mentioned earlier, we've seen a huge increase in families. So like, you know, folks with kids in elementary, middle, high school that are out on the street, living out of their car, and they've been such a big help to us this year. Nathan and now Heather have been incredible in the work that they do and making sure that those folks get contacted and get the support they need. So just wanted to get that out there too.
Yeah, I think we would love to see more, and Molly already talked about that with the outreach piece, that huge jump.
And the timing of the initial jump aligns very well with our encampments when we were able to close all the major encampments. That was in the same time period as well. So we can actually directly tie actions that we were taking at that time and see that outcome in the data.
And where we programmatically started street outreach case conferencing and a much more focused engagement on data entry and data cleanup on street outreach, so that we know where people are going. Street outreach became less of a we are keeping people alive and more about we are moving people through the housing system.
Which is why we need more.
As we dive into our.
I'm gonna start cutting my my programs, if I keep saying, because this is a conversation that Katie and I had is, and this is only helping to emphasize, like, street outreach is such a critical program in our system. And if we're doing it well, I'd love to continue the conversation around.
And I don't want
increasing it.
I don't want to discount that they're not keeping people alive on the streets too. They are keeping people
correct.
alive on the streets.
Right. But again, I mean, that's such a good point, because your interaction with street outreach is critical as well. And so it's just a piece of our system that is rocking. I need you to help me.
As
Okay.
we
Yes.
as we dive into like our data sharing agreement and what we can do with that, I think really putting like trying to like demonstrate the levels of acuity that are being served at each level is really important for this committee to understand too. And we've got that. It's just gonna be, how do we share that? How do we show that? And what do we learn from that? I think this committee is gonna really benefit from seeing that though.
Heather, I guess I'm not, and this might just be me, but I'm not understanding the inactive.
Yep.
Can you, I don't know what else you could say, but I just, nothing's clicking for me on it. And so I don't know. Yeah, please.
Do you want to try? Yeah. Okay. We see somebody call in their moment of crisis. They call Can You Connect? We do a phase 1 assessment, and then we never see them again. We never hear from them again. We have about 500 or so every month that go inactive. We push them to inactive after 90 days. So 90 days of never interacting with the system again. They're not calling Community Connect again. They're not interacting with street outreach. They're not interacting with access centers. No point are they touching the system again. Of that 500, give or take between 400 to 500 a month, only about 70 of those come back each month at some point in the next 2 years. So
in the next 2 years.
Correct. So we are doing a high volume of phase 1 assessments for somebody in their crisis moment, but then they self-resolve, they figure it out, they, whatever that may be, they're not contacting the system again, which says, as Zoe started earlier with Kisa, we have a really very easy to come into our system, and yet they're not staying in our system. And so we spend a lot of time on the phone with folks that are in their crisis mode. But B,
The burden too.
we then, what?
The burden too, like
Yeah.
the conversation.
And we don't spend, like, they're not coming back into our system. They're not staying in our system, which is great in a lot of ways because we are an accessible system where we are trying to problem solve with them over the phone. But also a phase one takes 20 to 25 minutes to do. And yet they're not the person that's going to be referred to our housing programs. They're very they're in poverty and at risk of homelessness for sure. And yet we don't see them coming back into our system all the time.
And we often don't know what happened to them. We don't get any information because they just don't come and we don't get any additional. And I want to flag that this is actually one of the ones that my team and I are going to be working on doing more deep dives to try to understand the profile of who becomes inactive. We've done some really simple looks at like by living situation, and there is definitely a higher inactive rate for those that are at risk or involuntarily doubled up. But there's still high rates for those who say that they are literally homeless or chronically homeless. And so it's not clearly that it's just that living situation. You know, it'd be a lot different if it's like, well, 90% of the inactives are those who say they're at risk. But it's not that cut and dry. So that's something my team is going to be taking on to try to fit into our reporting process of how can we do a little bit more deep dives of who is it that's going into inactive, what level of activity do they show. Some of them are true that they do a phase one and you never see them again. Some take a little bit longer before they go inactive. They may call and then they just drop off after a while. And so trying to figure out a little bit more about how can we predict who is more likely to go inactive and what are the factors, so that we can make decisions around, well, maybe there are certain people we just choose not to do a phase one assessment.
This is also a lot of the work that coordinated entry prioritization
Yeah.
is doing right
Yeah.
now with Keis's team. Because this is a lot of time. It's a lot of time on the phase one assessor that is doing this. It's a lot of time with Colin. And it's a significant amount of time for staff to go close inactives. We just went through a massive closing and it is 2 to 3 hours a week that staff spent on this.
So do we have people, I apologize, do we have people who are referred to a program, but within that 90 days haven't gone inactive, but they're just sitting on a wait list? Am I asking that in a?
More or less. Some of them they get a phase one, they never get referred, so they never hit our wait list. And that's
Why would they never get referred?
That's a data quality issue that we've got to work with those assessors to try to figure out why they're not getting that referral. But that's not the profile of everyone. But in general, I would say generally speaking, yes, they get a phase one, they get referred, they sit on the wait list, and then they just don't interact with our system again for 90 days.
Some of these also could be like, they touch an access center once, twice, 3 times, do a phase one with somebody at the access center, and then they stop coming to the access center, and now their phase one also would go inactive at that time after 90 days. So you're not touching any part of the system. So you might be on the housing wait list. It's not just Community Connect phone calls that is driving this, although that is a lot of our phase one inactives are. They just hit our phone call, they then maybe checked in once or twice, but then never show back up.
Right, it makes sense, oh my gosh, I'm on the brink, right? I'm gonna be evicted. I'm gonna make a phone call, see what my options are, but then I resolve it.
Right.
I get that piece of it.
Yeah.
The other pieces that aren't tracking for me, like where did you go?
You were being served by one of our Tri-County partners,
But that's really helpful information as I'm listening to our conversations, which sometimes feel strategic from other counties wanting to be like, well, we're serving more, we're serving yours.
Is that seen in the HMIS?
Nope.
Not really. It kind of is, but not really. And that's something we're working to change with our new HMIS system.
Oh, cool, okay.
Will
and
be to have
we're looking
overlap?
at trying to figure out cross comparison lists between our counties.
Great.
So we're working on it. It's
great.
a lot harder than you think.
Yeah, no, I'm sure.
I just think this could be something you want to unpack in a future meeting where you want to go a little deeper just on perhaps.
Yeah, yeah.
As you guys I think you guys are raising really crucial regional, anyway, a lot of questions.
Well, because part of me is like, that group of, whatever the word is, what's the word? Inactive, like want outreach to somehow engage, right? Because they're having such a positive impact. And so,
That's where outreach is, like, a lot of the time I show the way referrals getting put in, and that's how we're engaging. I would also say that in other communities, a lot of folks do not do a phase one until somebody's been literally homeless for 14 days. So that is the differential. We have a lot more at-risk phase ones than other systems of care. When the VI Spadat, which is the massively adopted that a lot of folks are moving away from for many good reasons, but you are not supposed to do a phase one until, or a VI Spadat until somebody's been homeless for 14 days. Because a lot of folks do self-resolve in that kind of crisis space. So we do phase ones a lot sooner because of our Pop AB definitions and a lot of other reasons, but we end up kind of having a lot more phase ones completed because somebody does not have to be literally homeless for us to complete a phase one.
I'm sorry that I don't know this answer. Do you have to do a phase one to get eviction prevention?
No. No, then that number will be bigger.
Yeah, and actually that is, we have,
Completely.
yeah, at one point that was the case and we have said like, please stop doing it.
I do think this notion of self-resolution is a really big one too. So I think
Yeah.
obviously not everyone inactive self-resolves.
Yes.
There's other lots of things,
Right.
but to the extent that there is a bigger
Yeah.
story that people do self-resolve.
Absolutely.
is, I think a really powerful message.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I can attest.
Yes.
As in this, and especially in these regional conversations. So
Right.
I think you
Yeah.
guys should keep it. Anyway, I would, my chair, Marshall.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a recommendation.
I just
Absolutely.
say something, and maybe as a recommendation or as a point, that probably we don't move into the homeless only, because then we will miss a huge population that Abel was pointing out, and as families at risk double up, usually that racial makeup look very different as well. So I hope we don't move into not, adding that at risk, which is an important part of our community.
I think there is an intention to move to 14 days. I do think though we are, that because of inactives, and as Molly mentioned, a lot of people are self-resolving. We're not capturing any of that self-resolve, right? We capture a lot of people that walk out of our system and we have no idea where they went. And so trying to track better down that data as to like, where else are they showing up? How can we make sure we close that loop is really important to show the impact of our system.
I think we're trying to do like a diversion conversation check. And that it's probably gonna give us a lot of like, whoa, they self-resolve because they become inactive because of that diversion conversation happening during that super important phone call that we want them to have all the information. Yeah.
And there, I mean, part of that is a follow-up, like. So they go through, they call you, they stop into your access center, you do the phase one. What's the follow-up? I mean, are you expecting them to come back all the time?
The client.
You don't call them?
No, oh, that
We
would
don't
be.
have capacity.
That
That's
would
what I
be-
figured. That's what I
know
figured.
Yeah.
Capacity is doing this for the mind of news.
Kim, you wanna come start making phone calls from our volunteer phone bank?
No, I totally, that's, and I question that because I don't know. And so, yeah, I'm not surprised it's a capacity issue. It's.
Later on, when we see those numbers decline, and to instead of becoming a client
Right.
driven
Yeah.
into assistant driven, but right now, there's no capacity.
Yeah.
When we did an analysis of Zoe's phone calls, we get over 2,000 phone calls a month.
Did you just make up that volunteer phone bank thing?
Yeah.
I mean, it might not be a horrible idea to. create
Right.
Some sort of a volunteer base to start doing some follow-up with
Yeah, what are
people.
you doing? Oh, that's lessons.
That's not a terrible idea.
What's the,
I'm not gonna run it.
I'll just like people come back in housing.
You know who should volunteer?
In your data, I'm not sure you have
Elected
the
officials.
like, how many people actually stay in the house.
On the other side of that phone.
We do have retention rates, and from the homeless rates that are part of our annual reporting. So retention is, it's a little bit different. PSH retention is if you were housed last fiscal year, were you still housed at the end of this fiscal year? Or were you like, did you exit permanent housing and you didn't return? Rapid rehousing is if you exited to permanent housing last year, you exited your rapid rehousing program to permanent housing last year. At the end of this fiscal year, did you return to homelessness or did you stay in another housing program? So you transferred at a higher level. So it's basically our best guess of are the house in a year later. So that's retention. And then returns to homelessness is again exit to permanent housing across any of our programs. And then did they come back into the shelter coordinated entry or street outreach?
Great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for condensing it. It was a lot of information.
Yeah.
Okay, we are at the end of our meeting. Did we answer your question by any chance? Like, do you feel like you
I
got
think
what
this
you
was
needed?
Really
Okay,
good discussion. Thank you.
perfect. We would like to have you back more often. I think this is the stuff that we like to, yeah, this helps us see the picture really well. So thank you so much. Okay, you guys, anything else for the good of the order? Awesome. I saw Nadia had a note for me that we need to make a motion to adjourn the meeting. I would take a motion to adjourn the meeting.
I'll make a motion.
Seconded.
Woo, there we are. Our meeting is adjourned.